The world has once again been shaken by developments from West Africa, where a rising figure in continental politics has made a decision that could redefine both his own nation's trajectory and the regional balance of power. Ibrahim Traoré, the young and uncompromising leader of Burkina Faso, has ordered the deployment of 3,000 soldiers to the border with Ivory Coast in response to the shocking death of Alino Faso, a prominent figure whose influence extended beyond political corridors into the very consciousness of the Sahel. The question on everyone's mind is whether this move signals the brink of war, or if it represents a new stage in Africa's long struggle for dignity, self-determination, and control over its future. To understand the gravity of Traoré's move, one must first revisit the backdrop against which these events have unfolded. Burkina Faso, long a country caught in the grip of poverty, insecurity, and international manipulation, has in recent years become a focal point of African resistance. The rise of Traoré was not merely a political accident, but the outcome of decades of frustration. His leadership has come to symbolize a sharp break with neocolonial influence, particularly the dominance of France and the conditional control of financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. His young age, charisma, and fiery speeches have set him apart from the older generation of African leaders who often compromised under foreign pressure. The death of Alino Faso, however, has created shockwaves. Alino was not just a domestic figure. He was regarded as a unifying symbol for anti-imperial sentiment in the Sahel. Known for his activism and his role in galvanizing grassroots movements, Alino embodied a vision of African unity that challenged entrenched powers both within and beyond the continent. His death, sudden and under circumstances that remain contested, has left many in Burkina Faso enraged, with suspicions ranging from internal sabotage to external meddling. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and grief, Traoré's decision to mobilize 3,000 soldiers has acquired a significance far greater than a mere tactical maneuver. It is being interpreted by analysts as both a message and a warning, not only to neighboring Ivory Coast, but to the wider international community. Ivory Coast is not just any neighbor. It has historically been seen as a bastion of pro-Western alignment in West Africa. Its economy is more diversified, its connections to France are deeper, and its military partnerships with Western nations stronger. The relationship between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast has often been strained, marked by disagreements over security, border management, and political allegiances in regional organizations. With the recent surge of anti-French sentiment sweeping through Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, Ivory Coast has become an outlier, maintaining a close rapport with Paris and Washington. This divergence makes the deployment of soldiers to the border especially combustible, because it highlights not just a security concern, but an ideological rift tearing across the region. The global reaction has been swift. Reports indicate that Washington, Paris, and Brussels are monitoring the situation with great concern, while Russia and China are watching closely, considering opportunities for influence and strategic partnerships. African leaders, meanwhile, have called for calm, fearing that open conflict between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast could unravel fragile security gains in the Sahel, where terrorist groups already exploit instability to their advantage. The African Union has reportedly prepared emergency consultations, while ECOWAS, the regional bloc, faces renewed pressure to assert its authority. Yet, given the history of strained relations between Burkina Faso and ECOWAS, Traoré's government may be disinclined to heed calls for restraint if they are perceived as biased or externally influenced. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, the deployment has ignited both pride and anxiety. Many view it as a bold step in defense of national sovereignty and a tribute to Alino Faso's legacy. Chants of solidarity, murals honoring Alino, and public gatherings have emerged in Ouagadougou, with citizens vowing to support Traoré's defiance. Yet others fear the prospect of war, questioning whether the country, already strained by years of insurgency, can withstand a confrontation with a more economically advanced neighbor. These voices remind us that beyond the rhetoric of sovereignty and dignity, real lives hang in the balance, and the costs of escalation could be devastating. International media outlets have framed the development through various lenses. Western publications tend to emphasize the risk of instability, portraying Traore as reckless and unpredictable. They highlight Burkina Faso's economic fragility and its reliance on military solutions. Conversely, African and alternative outlets portray the deployment as an assertion of self-determination, with Traore defending the dignity of his people against perceived foreign encroachment. Russian and Chinese state media, not surprisingly, have underscored the narrative of African independence, drawing parallels to broader global shifts away from Western dominance. The symbolic element of Alino Faso's death cannot be overstated. His life's work resonated with a generation that grew weary of endless lectures from Western capitals about democracy and development, while their resources were extracted and their nations destabilized. His message, echoed now in Traore's defiance, was that Africans must own their destiny, even if it comes at great cost. Thus, the deployment of soldiers is not simply about border security. It is a statement that Burkina Faso is prepared to bear the weight of confrontation in order to honor the ideals that Alino championed. Geopolitically, the situation poses dilemmas for every major player. For France, it is yet another reminder that its once unchallenged dominance in Francophone Africa is eroding at an unprecedented pace. Paris must now decide whether to back Ivory Coast more visibly, which could inflame anti-French sentiment further, or to exercise caution and risk losing credibility with one of its closest African partners. For the United States, the deployment threatens to complicate its counterterrorism operations in the region, which rely heavily on cooperation with both Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast. Washington's policymakers face the difficult task of balancing their support for Ivory Coast with the risk of alienating Burkina Faso and driving it deeper into the arms of Moscow or Beijing. For Russia, the crisis is an opportunity. Having already deepened its ties with Mali and Burkina Faso, Moscow could leverage the standoff to position itself as a security guarantor and a friend of Africa's sovereignty. Chinese policymakers, more cautious, would likely prefer stability to conflict, but would not ignore the chance to present themselves as economic partners who respect sovereignty. These dynamics illustrate how even a localized deployment of soldiers in West Africa reverberates across the corridors of global power. What remains uncertain is how Ivory Coast will respond. The leadership in Abidjan is aware that any aggressive move could trigger a wider escalation, yet it cannot appear weak in the face of Burkina Faso's challenge. The death of Alino Faso, whose connections extended across national borders, complicates matters further because it touches upon shared regional grievances about corruption, inequality, and foreign interference. In this sense, the crisis transcends bilateral tensions and taps into the deeper fissures that continue to shape Africa's modern political landscape. If history is any guide, the trajectory of this standoff will depend not only on military calculations, but on the narratives that emerge. Should Traoré succeed in framing the deployment as a protective act rooted in dignity and sovereignty, he may rally popular support not only in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. If, however, the narrative shifts toward recklessness and aggression, the costs could be politically disastrous. International actors will undoubtedly attempt to shape these narratives, deploying their media, diplomacy, and economic tools to sway perceptions. At its heart, this moment is a test of Africa's ability to assert control over its own path. For too long, crises in the continent have been mediated, managed, or manipulated by external powers. Traoré's defiance, for better or worse, represents a rejection of that legacy. Whether this defiance leads to war, negotiation, or transformation remains to be seen, but what is certain is that the eyes of the world are now fixed on Ouagadougou and Abidjan. The deployment of 3,000 soldiers is not merely a military gesture. It is a political declaration, a psychological maneuver, and a symbolic tribute to the fallen Alino Faso. It has placed Burkina Faso at the center of international debate, reminding the world that Africa is no longer willing to accept the status quo without challenge. For analysts and policymakers alike, the unfolding situation is a stark reminder that the global order is shifting, and that even nations once dismissed as peripheral are now asserting themselves in ways that can no longer be ignored. The coming weeks will reveal whether this moment becomes a spark for war, a catalyst for dialogue, or a milestone in Africa's ongoing struggle for sovereignty. What remains undeniable is that Traoré's decision has already altered the calculus of power in West Africa and, by extension, the wider world. The legacy of Alino Faso, immortalized by this defiance, now lives on in the uncertain but determined steps of a nation that refuses to be silent, even in the face of overwhelming odds.